In this lecture, we're going to be talking about all the different types of 3D art, which includes sculpture, crafts, performance art, conceptual art, and outdoor and site-specific art. When we hear the word sculpture, unlike the other types of art we've talked about that have mostly been two-dimensional, sculpture is the one type of art that's actually three-dimensional, sculpture and architecture, of course. And so with sculpture, it's really important that whenever you see it, that you see it from multiple angles, because that's usually how your appreciation is gained through looking at all the sides. And so it's a little more complex because the artist usually considers all of those different sides as well. So it's kind of hard in textbooks and PowerPoints to really give students or an audience a really full appreciation for what they're looking at, because who knows what they're looking at. It could be, super large in scale, or there could be some interactive part to it. So sculptures and architecture are usually best to see in person if you have the opportunity. There are three categories for sculpture. The first one is what we call in the round, and it's very straightforward. It literally means you could just walk around it because it's fully three-dimensional. The example you see here on the slide is actually called Cloudgate, and it is in Chicago. And it's a really beautiful sculpture by Anish Kapoor, and it's made from stainless steel that's been polished so much that it acts as a mirror as well. And not only can you walk around it, you can also walk underneath it also. And it's also always changing because the reflection, all the things around it are not always the same. So if you ever get a chance to go to Chicago, make sure you go check it out. However, there, most of the people call it the Big Bean because that's their nickname for it, because it kind of does look like a bean. To me, it looks like a big drop of like mercury hitting the ground. Now, the second category for sculpture is what we call low relief or bas relief sculpture, and that means that it's a three-dimensional piece of art. However, it's coming off of a two-dimensional surface. And the best example of this are coins, are money. And most cultures throughout history use some type of metallic objects, little small metallic pieces, as their currency. And usually there was something carved or etched into it. And because it's slightly three-dimensional, we call it low relief or bas relief sculpture. So that would be things like ceramic plates, maybe that have things carved into them. That would be an example of this. Carvings on like the sides of buildings and walls would also be example of bas relief. And a lot of times I have students, they ask me the question, well, why is it that we use metal as currency? And believe it or not, most people believe that we like shiny things, like shiny paintings and artwork and metal and diamonds, all because it reminds us subconsciously of water. And because water really is the most valuable thing on our planet, and we're, such a huge percentage of water ourselves, that whenever we see shiny things, we're attracted to them. So you don't have to know that. I just thought you might find it interesting. Now, the third type of sculpture that we'll talk about is what we call high relief sculpture. And it too comes from a two-dimensional surface like the bas relief sculpture. However, it also extends more into the third dimension. So with this, if you could see this sculpture here on the screen in person, it actually looks like the people are like pushing through the wall and coming out of it. And so think of like things like gargoyles on the sides of buildings. They're still attached to a flat surface, but they're coming out more into the third dimension. Now, there are several different sculptural processes. Most of them are pretty simple, and I've added the vocabulary and the definitions throughout them, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing them. They're also pretty common practices that you may have done before when you were a child, or even like when you're cooking, because they're pretty common terms. Modeling, for example, is a manipulative process that's additive, and it's where you just take a pliable material and you push and pull it together until you're happy with the form. And so a lot of sculptors will work with clay or plaster or even wax, and that's how they'll create their sculpture. So it's very forgiving. So as a child, we've all probably played with Play-Doh before, and it's a very similar process. There's a couple of other vocabulary words here that you need to know: armature and maquette. The word armature has the word arm inside of it, and that's how I used to remember it, because the armature is kind of like the internal skeleton of a sculpture or a work of architecture, and it adds support for that. If you were like me when I was a kid, I would always try to make really big things with Play Doh, and they would always fall over. And just like people, if we didn't have our skeleton system, we would just be kind of like blobs floating around. And so these armature works as a support system. So a lot of times with sculptors, they will have a wooden form that's kind of like a stick figure that they'll add clay on, or they'll use wire or something even sturdier. And with architecture, it wasn't until the invention of steel before we could build skyscrapers. And inside of most skyscrapers, they have a steel structure on the inside that's the armature that the building is built around so that it can withstand, all the elements. A maquette, that is a small scale version of a sculpture or a piece of architecture. If you think about some of these large scale buildings and sculptures, people don't have the money, usually, an artist at least, to build these things and then try to sell them. And so, usually, what they'll have to sell or propose to maybe a city or a company is a maquette, and that will be like a small scale version. And sometimes they will even make kind of like a little diorama, like we did when we were kids, showing what it will look like in that space, but a small version of it. And that will help people envision what the final product will look like. So here's an example of someone, they have kind of a small scale version of a sculpture to help them learn as well. So these are all modeled pieces of art. This piece is at the Kimball Art Museum if you get a chance to go there. I tried to throw in some photographs that I've taken at some of the local museums, hoping that you may see some of these pieces when you go there. But this piece is entirely made of clay that's been fired and pieced together and then painted. And it's outside in front of the Kimball. It's also different on each side. So again, this shows that sculpture is always best to see in person so you can see both sides of it or all sides of it. Casting is the second process that we'll talk about. Casting means that you're pouring a liquid into a mold to make the sculpture. And so this is kind of like the printmaking of, uh, of three-dimensional art. So you make an original, somehow remove it and make a mold of it, and then you can make multiples by pouring a liquid material such as bronze or wax or plaster, whatever you want to, inside of it. These are the steps of casting that I just went over. And then these are some examples of people pouring different liquid materials into the molds of these. Now, a lot of times with the molds, you can't tell what it's going to be because there's all these pipes coming off of it. And that's so that air doesn't get trapped inside of the sculpture. They have to have all these pipes for the air to come out so you get a solid form. But you can cast things in wax, latex, plaster, bronze. There's all sorts of ways to cast materials. Even like you saw with Cosimo Cavallaro, he used chocolate. Now, I threw in some examples of artists that did cast forms, and both of the ones I chose are super realist sculptors. And Dwayne Hanson was one that he used actual people to make molds of, and then he would use liquid fiberglass to pour into the molds, and then he would paint them with an airbrush, and then he would put actual clothing on them. And when you would see these in galleries and museums, a lot of times they look so lifelike, people go up and talk to them because they can't tell. And these are just some more of his pieces, and there's a link if you want to see some more of his work. Ron Mueck is an artist that recently, over the past 10 years or so time, this is one he did. It's about the size of a baby, like an actual baby, but it's an old man, and it's wrapped in blankets. And this was looking down in on it on the floor. So when you walk by, you almost can't tell what it is until you look in it. And when I saw this one, I thought, who would leave their old man baby on the floor? Like, this is weird, because it looks so real. And it was kind of sad. And it made me think of those moments when we're adults that we wish we could just be a kid again and get in the fetal position and have someone hold us and tell us it'll be okay. But you really can't. Once you're grown up, you have to move on with your lives. But his pieces are very kind of intimate like that. This was one he made. This one actually is in Fort Worth. The Modern Museum there purchased this. So if you go there, it may be out on display for you to get up close and see in person. But it's a little old woman. It's about probably 12 inches tall. It's very small and it looks so real. But to me, it reminded me of my grandmother when I saw it, of kind of this different generation that is just kind of sitting and waiting for a visitor or company to come see them, or even a stranger to kind of knock on the door. And this was just another one. It was very small at the back of the museum. Now, these are some of his larger sculptures. And again, these are cast materials. He casts plaster, latex, a bunch of things. He'll use whatever he has to make it look real. But this one's called Big Man, and it's probably over 6 feet tall, and he's sitting down. Like, it's huge. And when I saw this one, it really kind of freaked me out, because you feel like this person's been in captivity. Maybe they're a prisoner of war. Maybe they're, um, in a psychiatric hospital. For some reason, they've been robbed of everything that they could harm themselves or someone else with. And yeah, you just see this conspiracy happening in his mind of, what's happening here. And I have a close-up shot so you can just see the detail that are in his pieces. This is one, the person sitting in the chair, that's an actual person. And the big bed and person, that's the sculpture. So again, just to let you see how large in scale they are. And I think this one, he leaves it open to your interpretation. But when I see it, it makes me think of those days we've all had where we can't get out of bed, like we were physically and mentally just drained. Maybe this woman has had a bad relationship that ended. Maybe she's lost a child. Maybe she's suffering from depression or some other illness. But whatever it is, she's stuck in bed. And I think we can all relate to that feeling. It's really funny and kind of strange when you're around his sculptures and you see other people interacting with them. I took this photo and I felt like these people, I was like, get out of her face, like she's having a bad day. You almost want to feel like you have to protect them in some way. Here we see that's him, and he's actually fixing her hair because these are so lifelike. A lot of times he does have to primp them before each show. I just threw this in because I thought you guys would find it funny. This is a huge boy that he sculpted, and you can see, it kind of reminds me of that awkwardness of our teenage years where we're going through puberty and we don't know our own strength. And then this, if I haven't said it already, this is one of my favorites of his. It's a big sculpture of a baby that's been newborn. It hasn't even been cleaned off yet. And it's like the size of an SUV. It's huge. Those are real people standing behind it. And the title of this piece was called It's a Girl. And I walked around it and it was a girl. I checked it out. But it looks like a big giant has just birthed this baby on the floor. And it's really shocking when you see it in person. And I read the description of the piece, and it said that whenever he had his first child, he was just blown away by what a miracle it was, and he wanted to kind of share that miracle with the rest of the world. And I thought, I took a group of students when that show was on exhibit, just because I wanted them to see it. And a lot of the students were like, "That's disgusting." And I told them that I thought there should be one of these in every high school cafeteria that you guys should have to dance around at prom. But anyway, it's kind of funny when you think about it. But I think he's just celebrating life. And then I was curious how his pieces ship around the world. And he ships them in big crates, and often they have to be taken by boat because they're so large and heavy. And these are just some other views. Now, people also, like I said, more traditionally would cast with molten metal like bronze. And often you'll see like huge, large scale bronze sculptures outside because they're so heavy, people really can't take them. I took these photos. This is a piece that's in front of the Kimball Art Museum. And this is another piece on the side of the Kimball Art Museum, also made from cast bronze. This piece is by the Modern Museum in Fort Worth, and it looks like wood, but I wanted to show you just like painting can be deceptive and different types of paint can look like different things. This looks like it's made out of wood, but it's actually cast bronze. So there are a lot of ways to manipulate the media that's used to look like other things. Now, carving is the another type of sculptural process, and they say carving is the most challenging, I think, because it's only subtractive. So if you're carving a sculpture and you get to a certain point and you mess up, you have to just make everything smaller to make it work. And I took several sculpture classes in college, and we had to do a life-size human torso, and I remember our professor had us fill a huge, like, industrial trash can filled with plaster, and it weighed over 100 pounds. And we were supposed to carve someone from their waist to their head. And when I started, I was like, "Oh, I've got this. It's going to be awesome." And as I carved and carved, it ended up being only about 2 feet tall because I kept having to make it smaller because I kept messing up. So carving is really challenging. Now, a lot of artists choose to carve a variety of different things, from different types of wood to different types of stone. But when we think about people before technology carving things like marble and granite, to me, I'm just in awe because those materials are so hard. I don't see how they even did that, but without the materials that we have today. So, this is an example of a carved wooden piece by Elizabeth Catlett, and it's made from laminated wood, very beautiful, very smooth. These are really fun. I did some sculptures like this when I was younger. This is another piece that was carved wood that's been little small pieces of wood were carved and hollowed out and then assembled together and painted, but very beautiful woodwork. And then we've talked about some of Michelangelo's sculptures before, but here are a few more. I really like these ones because some people say they're not finished, but he's dead, so they are pretty finished. But he wrote in his journal that he didn't like to fully free the figures because he thought if he left part of the unfinished stone, that people would have more respect for what he was able to do. And I think that's really true. When you're able to see how he carved this rough looking rock that you probably wouldn't even look at twice if you were walking past it on the street. And then you look at it and see that he made it look like flesh and fabric. Like, it's amazing how he was able to do that. These were also supposed to be slaves, and I think by the way they're trapped in the rock, symbolically, it makes them even more true to that form. Now, constructing and assembling, that means basically just putting objects together that maybe don't naturally go together. And that was really brought about by Picasso, believe it or not. Picasso is mostly known for being a painter, but after a while, he kind of got bored with painting, and he had asked one of his friends that was a sculptor, saying, he was like, "Hey, can you help me learn to make sculpture?" And his friend said, "Well, I'm just working at an automobile plant right now. I just got out of war, and I haven't really been inspired lately." And Picasso said, "Well, how do you make cars?" And his friend said, "Well, you just weld pieces together of metal." And Picasso was like, "Well, can you weld metal together to make art?" And he was like, "I don't know. Let's see if people will accept it." And I know that sounds so silly because everybody knows that welded metal is art. So it's really not that old that welding was a sculptural process as we see it today. Now, a couple of other vocabulary words that you need to know. Assemblage is where you take found objects and put them together in a way that they normally wouldn't go. And so sometimes that's kind of like a 3D collage. And ready-mades is artwork that is conceptual, where the artist doesn't make it, they just choose an object to be symbolic of something else. And it's a little bit harder sometimes for people to maybe appreciate. So Picasso's friend that worked at an automobile plant, his name was Julio Gonzalez, and people consider him to be the founder of welding as an art process. And you can see some of his sculptures here. So nowadays we see modern and contemporary artists working with metal as a medium and welding it together to make all sorts of different things. This is also in Fort Worth. It's in front of the Modern Art Museum there, and it's big pieces of steel that have been welded together at the top, and you can actually walk inside of it. It works kind of as a outdoor structure as well, and you can see these are different views of it. And then here's an example of an assemblage. On the left is a bull that Picasso made from taking a metal bicycle seat and metal handlebars and welding them together, making something new with it, which it looks like a bull. And then a ready-made is where you choose something to represent something else, and you don't necessarily make it. And Marcel Duchamp in 1917, he took a urinal because he heard of this art committee that said that they were not going to judge art anymore, and that they were going to accept anything that anybody made as art, and that they would display it as long as everybody paid the entry fee. And so Marcel Duchamp was a famous European artist, and he thought, well, I want to see if these Americans are really true to their word. And so he, under a fake name, he wrote R. Mutt on a urinal and submitted it as a sculpture, and it was rejected. And he did it just to kind of make a point that no one will ever accept everything as a type of art. But it was kind of funny at the same time. Some people say there's a hidden content there, that in the early 1900s there was a joke that the only good thing about America was their plumbing and their bridges. Now, kinetic sculpture, we've talked about kinetic art before. Kinetic sculptures are just sculptures that move, and we've talked about artists like Alexander Calder that made these movable sculptures. Mixed media sculptures, just like mixed media 2D art, it would include combining several materials together. And these are a few artists here that combine different materials together to create a unique piece of art. This piece here is suspended up in the air, and it's about a folklore story about using your mind over force, where a army of men that didn't have a lot of ammo tricked the enemies to fire their ammo at a boat that was empty, and they wasted all their ammo, and the next day they were able to go make them surrender without any violence at all. And so you see the vessel kind of floating with all the arrows in it above the crowd. This artist used all kinds of materials to make her work, and you can see wood, paint, drawing materials, photography, a handbag, and there's even a taxidermy dog's head on the little dog that you see. And she didn't harm a dog. There was no animals harmed. It was a dog that had been stuffed that she found, and you added it to her sculpture. Robert Rauschenberg was a Texas artist that made it world famous, and he was from Port Arthur, Texas, down by Galveston, and he made it to New York, and he traveled all around the United States trying to make it as an artist. And for a while, he lived in New York City, and during that time period, he was very, very poor, working multiple jobs to try to make a living and to try to make a name for himself as an artist. And he only had New York City as his art store. So he would walk around the street looking for anything he could find to make art with it. And so during that time period, he was combining three-dimensional things with two-dimensional things. And so he called those his combines, because he was kind of combining 2D and 3D art together. And so when we look at these mixed media pieces, you can see like a actual bird coming out of his canvas. There's a pillow tied to one of them. There's photography, cardboard, this type of goat creature with a tire around its stomach on top of a wooden panel with paint on it. And then the image in the middle, that's an actual bed. One night he was laying in bed and he thought that he was sad because he didn't have any money to go buy canvas, and he felt like painting. And then he was like, well, you know what? My bed has sheets on it, and my sheets are made of cotton, and that's what canvas is made of. What if I just stretch my canvas with my sheets? And so he did that. And then he was like, well, I don't have any sheets. I might as well put my pillow up there too. And then he borrowed a blanket from his friend and put paint all over it. And it really became a symbol of being an artist. Like artists never really stop being creative. They take creativity from their dreams. They're always taking in inspiration. And I think it just kind of also shows the power of the bed, because so much life happens in our beds. Most of us are conceived in a bed, we're born in a bed. Most people rest in a bed and recover in a bed when we're sick. People share love in a bed, and most people hope to peacefully die in a bed someday. So the bed is a really kind of powerful staple of our lives. Now, installations are really cool, and they're becoming more and more popular these days with sculpture. An installation is where the viewer becomes part of the art. And so the sculpture goes off the walls and all around and sometimes creates a room. James Turrell is also a Texas artist that he creates these light spaces. And if you've ever seen the cell phone video with Drake, that the inspiration was this artist, James Turrell. And if you go to this link, you'll see one of his pieces, but usually they're like rooms that he builds that have different lighting effects that it's really kind of subtle, but it almost feels like you're in a spaceship. It's a unique experience to say the least. But I would Google him if you're interested. This artist, Wame Plenza, he has work all over the world, but he also creates installations, and usually they involve sculptural pieces as well as interactive pieces that the viewer has to get inside of things and walk around while the sculptures are there as well. He also created a public sculpture in Chicago that this was the maquette, but it's these two long pillars that have projected imagery of people spitting out water, and water actually comes out of it, and it's a public fountain that people play in. Now, when I talk about craft media refers to uh, anything that has like a utilitarian purpose to it. So, in the beginning of the class, um, when we talked about art for day-to-day living, that's kind of the category for craft media. It's not a lesser form of art. It just means that it's a type of art that we use for another purpose. So that would involve ceramics, glassware, fiber making, which involves weaving, embroidery, tapestry, book making. There's so many things, paper making, metal arts, which would include like furniture, things like that, as well as jewelry is a type of metal art. And then, of course, carpentry and wood art, not just sculpture, but also utilitarian things like furniture as well. At Northlake, we do teach ceramics, and so if you're looking for a fun art class to take a ceramics class. It's so much fun. You learn different techniques like the coil method, the slab method. You learn to throw on the wheel, make pinch pots. You learn about glazes, which are different chemicals that you paint on the pottery and you fire it a second time, and it makes these glass-like finishes on the pottery. And you can actually make things that you can take home and use or give as gifts. And we also do a process at Northlake called raku, where you take the pottery out of the kiln when it's really hot and you throw it into a hole in the ground of paper, and it burns, and it actually captures the flame marks on the pottery, making it very metallic looking. So it's a really cool process. So if you're interested, take a class. It's literally like a class. You get to play with mud and make really cool stuff. Glassware and glass blowing is another process. Of course, people make bowls and other glassware that we use. And the images on the left are made by an artist named Del Chihuly, who is the artist, if you've ever been to Las Vegas, in the Bellagio, that glass ceiling that's got all the colorful sea-like looking glass. He is the artist that creates those really unique things. Also, if you go to the Dallas Museum of Art, they have some of his pieces up in the windows down by the bookstore, gift store area. Like I said before, fiber arts includes anything where natural or synthetic fibers are used. So this could involve paper making, book making, basket weaving, crocheting, all of those different types of art making and craft processes. And metal arts would involve jewelry making, furniture, other decor, things like that. And jewelry making, we offer some classes in that at Northlake, and they offer it at El Centro too. And believe it or not, when you're working with silver and gold and things like that in its pure form, it's not very expensive, but it's just when people sell jewelry for a lot of money. So you could learn how to do some pretty cool stuff. I've even had students before take those classes and they made their own wedding bands. I thought that was kind of sweet. And then, of course, using wood and carpentry to make furniture and other type of utilitarian objects. Now, another type of 3D art that is a little taboo is what we call performance art. And that's where artists use their bodies, and it is a performance, not necessarily a dance or a play, but something that's unique. And it all started because some artists just started saying, everything I do is art. And a lot of this is kind of disturbing and strange, and it's hard for people to understand, but people tend to be very curious about it. I promise you, you won't find me doing performance art anywhere on the weekends because I'm a pretty shy person, even though my artwork's really loud and colorful. But some people, they're into this thing. Everybody's different. And I've had friends and coworkers before that did performance art, and I would go watch them, and I was always disturbed and intrigued at the same time because it's really kind of hard to explain. You never know what to expect, and but you never forget it. That's one of the cool things about it, is that it really makes you pay attention. So these are some of the what we call conceptual or body artists and performance artists that I have some links for here. And a lot of them I have links because they're videos of the actual performance. So you may click on some of these. Marina Abramovic is probably one of the most famous performance artists in the world right now. She's in her early 70s, I believe, or late 60s, and she had a retrospective at the Modern Museum of Art in New York City just a few years ago, and that got her a lot more attention. And there's a documentary on, I think it's on Netflix, called The Artist is Present, where you can learn more about her life and some of the um, dangerous performances that she's done throughout her life. And she also opened her own college where you can go to learn how to be a performance artist, and it's called the Marina Abramovic Institute. And Lady Gaga actually was one of her students. And if you Google Marina and Lady Gaga, you can actually see videos of Lady Gaga going through some of her body control sort of training classes and things like that, like walking through the woods blindfolded and standing in the middle of the river screaming, and all kinds of very strange things like that that would make me very uncomfortable. But some people like really pushing their bodies and their minds to these limits. I like watching it. I think it's interesting, but I would be too embarrassed or shy to do some of these things. So this is a description of one of her performances where she basically gave her body up to the public. People could come in, and any object that was next to her on this table, they could use her without getting in trouble. And before you get any crazy ideas about this kind of stuff, this was all approved by lawyers, and so nobody could be sued or anything like that. So don't hurt anybody, and don't try to get away with it and call it art. You have to get permission to do things like that. But these are some of the photographs of that exhibit, the things people did to her. This is another performance of her. And this is another performance artist, and there's some other links about him. Some of his projects were kind of silly, where he would just like spit out water and say he was a fountain. So sometimes it's kind of more comedic, and sometimes it's more serious. Joseph Beuys, most of his performances were very serious. He had lived through World War II, and he was actually born as one of Hitler's youth, and so he was a born Nazi. And of course, after the war, finding out the truth and what all happened over there, you can imagine he needed a lot of therapy. During the war, he was shot down in a plane, and he crashed into the snow, and his co pilot died. And he was actually taken care of by these native people in Germany that nursed him back to health. He only came to the United States one time, and during that time, he did a performance where he had a live coyote in a gallery with him for 7 days, and they lived in harmony. And the whole point of the performance was that a lot of times we act in fear and violence, when really it just takes a little bit of patience to be able to cohabitate with anyone. And this was just another performance he did. Kind of strange stuff. Chris Burden was a performance artist that actually got permission to let someone shoot him in a gallery and call it art. Again, pretty strange, but what makes it strange is just because it's called art. And I think that's part of what performance art does, is it exposes how absurd our society is. People watch the news every night while they're eating dinner, hearing about all sorts of horrible acts of violence and war and things like that. But when it's called art, it seems so strange. And the thing about it being art is they were all willing participants, where people that are victims of violence are not always willing participants. So sometimes things like this seem really strange, but it's really just exposing how strange our society is and how morbid we are kind of as people. He was also scared to be electrocuted, so he did a performance where he touched live electrical wires to his chest. It made a cool photo, but he did die for a second and had to be resuscitated and brought back to life. So again, please do not do any of these things unless you have really good insurance and you have legal assistance to help you with this sort of stuff. He also locked himself in a locker for 5 days. He said that it was really hard for him to hear about people held against their will in captivity and prison and prisoners of war and people that are in sex slaves. And he wanted to know what it felt like. So he lived in a locker for 5 days. And you can read the measurements of the locker. It was 2 feet by 2 feet by 3 feet. So it was very small. He didn't eat for those days. I think they fed him a tube with water while he was in there, but he had no food for 5 whole days. And he said he wanted to do it so he'd be more sensitive about those people experiencing those hardships around the world. And then this woman, she actually went on a crash diet back in the 70s and went on a workout plan. And she started photographing herself from the front, the back, and both sides every day for a whole month while she was on this diet to photograph her body changing. And she called it carving a traditional sculpture. And when I saw this, I thought, well, this is awesome. I need to think of working out like sculpture. And so a few years ago, I got really fit, lost all this weight, and then I was skinny and hungry, and I was like, gaining weight is also a type of sculpture. And so I kind of let that go. But anyway, I thought it was a nice way to look at working out and stuff like that. This artist, I love his work, Felix Gonzalez Torres. This artist took body art and performance art to a whole nother level. He's still living and still making art, but in the 1990s, there was all this talk of cloning and stuff like that. And he thought, what if I take my own blood over a period of a month and I make a mold of my head and I put my own blood in the mold and freeze it? And that's just what he did. This is a visual self portrait, a biological self portrait. And if he ever needs a full blood transfusion, they just have to defrost it, and there he goes. And so it's kind of disgusting, but very intriguing at the same time. And those of you that maybe you're in biology and things like that, all the blood in your body can fit in your head. And so he took a little bit at a time until he got a full body's worth, and that's what you see here. So it's kind of creepy, but if they ever do want to clone him, they have plenty of blood cells to work with. And then site specific art and outdoor art, these things are usually outdoor and open to the public. So land art means that it's the earth that's been manipulated. And this is a piece in Utah where it goes into the lake and it makes this spiral. And depending on the level of the lake, sometimes it's visible, sometimes it's not. This artist, Andy Goldsworthy, he goes out into nature and he makes things out of nature, sculptures, and then he photographs them, and that's his art. And so most of his actual art you never see in the gallery, you just see photos of it in the gallery. So these, one day he went for a walk and he collected icicles and then stuck them together to make the piece that you see here. He's really an interesting artist. You would think someone that's outside all the time would be very peaceful, but I watched a documentary about him called Rivers and Tides, and a lot of times his pieces will fall apart while he's working on them, and he cusses a whole lot. This piece is a iceberg that's been dyed red with like a snow cone like dye. And this artist wanted, Marco Evaristi, he wanted to draw attention to the melting ice caps and global warming because a lot of people, deny what's happening to the world. And so he dyed it red and then he photographed it as it melted into the ocean. And even people use things off the planet to make art. This artist put all of these metal rods in a field where there's a lot of thunderstorms to generate more lightning, and then takes photographs of the lightning striking these poles. And then these artists, it's a pair of artists, Christo and Jean Claude. They like to cover things with fabric, from buildings to these flags they put through this park. They recently covered an island and a bridge and all these things. And they like to make art that they say you can see from outer space. And so they do these strange kind of outdoor projects like this. And then ephemeral art, that means that it's temporal. And so this one artist created this elaborate fireworks show that would make this once in a lifetime rainbow that went over the East River in New York City. And public art, like I said, it's just out for the public to see. Sometimes these are city commissions that anybody can apply to. And so if you're ever have great ideas about public sculpture, you don't have to necessarily make it. You just have to present the idea, and the city will help you find someone to help you build your sculpture if you get selected for the prize. And we saw this one at the beginning of the lecture. And then monuments are a little bit different. Those are meant to in memory of something. And so here we could see this one represents like Picasso, and it's a city where they have this cow. They have all these cow sculptures around, and then everyone's painted to pay tribute to a different person. And then we have monuments like the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin to remember all of those that were lost during the Holocaust in World War II. And then even in Washington, D.C., we have the Vietnam Memorial that Maya Lin created. And one of the things that I find so inspiring about this memorial is not just all the thought that went into it, but Maya Lin, a lot of people don't know, she was a undergraduate student. She was, I don't know if she was at a community college, but she was an undergraduate student, and she just applied for the city posting they had for if anybody has great ideas for a war memorial, what would you do? And she applied, and she won. And then they helped her get the workers, and they gave her the money for the sculpture, and now it's one of the most famous memorials that's out there. And she was just an undergrad student, and that of course helped her the rest of the career. So, like I said, a lot of times art is just about the idea, and if it's a big project, you can have other people help you do it that have that skill set to help you. So don't ever feel free to don't ever be scared to share your ideas. Just make sure people don't steal them.